Right, so I guess we'll start and people will join through the meeting. So great to have you with us. So welcome to today's seminar on mitigating medical disinformation and machine learning approach. As you probably all know, this event is part of the Samuel Initiative on Responsible AI in Medicine at Tel Aviv University, where we want to promote ethical and effective use of AI in healthcare. And today we're pleased to have Shiri, Dr. Shiri Dori-Hacohen with us. Shiri is an assistant professor at the School of Computing at the University of Connecticut, where she leads the Reducing Information Ecosystem Threats Lab. Her research focuses on threats to the online information ecosystem and the social technical AI alignment problem. Shiri promotes multidisciplinary collaboration with experts in medicine, public health, social sciences, and humanities. And she's served as a PI on federal grants from the National Science Foundation, and her work has guaranteed several prestige awards. So today, Shiri will introduce an initiative aimed at mitigating medical disinformation, biased information that persists in the medical curricula even after being debunked. This initiative employs machine learning to systematically identify and flag potentially biased text for expert review, significantly accelerating the traditionally labor-intense process of curriculum evaluation. So Shiri, great to have you with us, and the floor is yours, and thank you.
Thank you, Amir. It's actually saying I can't share. Can you maybe make me co-host again? Hopefully that'll fix it. Okay, yeah. Great. Let me know if everyone can see this all right.
Yes, we can see. Yep.
Great. Yes, so thank you, Amir, for the warm introduction, and all of you for having me here. As Amir said, I'm Shiri Dori-Hacohen. I am faculty at UConn, and I will tell you today about our initiative on fairness via AI. And this is joint work, so I'll tell you, this is actually two different papers that I'm going to be presenting. So I'll go backwards. The second one is that I'll talk about is shared by these folks. We're very lucky to have a very warm collaboration with WPI Worcester Polytechnic Institute, University of Oxford, a nonprofit Midan, who is a leading expert in software for fact checkers, and the University of Washington, specifically the Seattle Children's Hospital Research Center. And then now these are the co-authors on the first paper. Some of them are the same, some of them are not. And part of this work was actually written when I was still running my startup, which is now deceased. But at the time, one of my co-authors, Dr. Keen Song, and I were at OCODE, and I was already starting my work at UConn as well. So I'll talk about this one first, and then we'll go to the technical details after. So let me tell you a little bit about an aspirational gap. On one hand, we have a growing interest and accelerating progress in looking at fairness in AI and trying to understand and mitigate bias, algorithmic manipulation, and discrimination through algorithmic measures. And on the other hand, we have an incredibly pressing movement for equity, including in medicine and beyond. In the US in particular, this is focused on race, but of course, I don't need to tell you that there are other issues like ethnicity and gender and disability, all of which are really important and sort of these are folks that are either underrepresented or under-resourced in medicine, as well as other elements of advances in science, technology, and so forth. So when we look at these two things, there seems to be a bit of a gap, right? We know that there is bias and inequality in the real world, and fairness in AI research is trying to mitigate it, but it's unclear how much it's actually doing. So if you look at the standard AI practice, we have some incoming data set, sometimes very large, maybe it's all of the internet, and we use it to train an AI model. And then that AI model makes recommendations or predictions. And if you look at most fairness in AI research, it really focuses on training that magnifying glass on the recommendations and predictions, sometimes on the model itself, and asking, is there bias? And if so, can we fix the model or the outputs to make it less biased? But Sandra Mason, a law scholar, wrote an amazing paper. I highly recommend checking it out. It's quite short, but very, what the Israelis would say, lapanim. Very like in your face, very high quality paper. And in it, she's describing a principle that she calls bias in, bias out. Those of you from computer science might recognize this as an allusion to garbage in, garbage out, which is a well-known principle in computer science. But here, what Mason is saying is that when you are taking the input to the model and it's biased, then almost by definition, your output is also going to be biased. And so there is sort of a ceiling on how well we can make the model perform, given that the real world is actually biased. And so we have this Sisyphean task, like we try to fix the model, and maybe like we make some progress, but then the real world comes back and haunts us, and then rolling us back down the hill, so to speak. So the real inequities in the real world are serving as inputs to the model. So even if we try to debias the model, we still end up with a lot of biases that are actually inherent in the real world. So our proposal flips the sequence a little bit. Instead of trying to make fairness in AI, we propose to do something a little bit different, which we call fairness via AI. And this is rooted from our colleagues' insights in medical education, sociology, and anti-racism, specifically Dr. Montenegro, who's our main collaborator in medicine. He's a PhD MD who's done his work on sociology and race relations in medicine. And so we're taking a bit of a broader lens and a greater aspiration. So we want to try to use AI to study and remedy situations in society that are already inherently unequal. And we want to use AI carefully and deliberately to accelerate this progress, to debias the world as opposed to debiasing AI. So as part of this work, we coined a term we call bisinformation, or biased information. My husband, who's also Israeli, teases me because in Hebrew it sounds like beast, like you're eating something. But I do think it captures a unique and challenging aspect of the information landscape, which is not currently being discussed. And this is specifically when information is biased against a group or a population. That can be gender bias or racial, ethnic bias. It can be many different types of bias. And then the information that you get is colored by this bias. So it may be that it's false completely, in which case it would be in this overlap here between mis and bisinformation, but sometimes it's just biased. It's not actually untrue exactly, but it's presented in a way which implies, lesser or unequal situation, which may not actually be true, or it implies a causal relationship between the identity of a group to the relationship. So I promise I will give you some examples in a moment, but I want to just call out, we are here in a context of medicine, and the same for our project. We are focusing specifically on biased information in the medical space, but I want to note that there's plenty of biased information outside of medicine, and we're not even talking about that today, but it is something that we're keeping an eye out for our future work because we think it's really relevant and interesting. So by the way, stop me anytime with questions. I will keep talking until the time is up or you tell me otherwise, but don't hesitate to interrupt me if anything is unclear. So we proposed a few guiding pillars for fairness via AI research. We think and believe that it is more effective and impactful than the quote-unquote standard fairness in AI approach. And we also think that transdisciplinary collaboration is really critically needed in order to effectively and ethically study society's largest challenges. And that's why we collaborate, as Amir kindly said, with social scientists, humanities researchers, and medical and public health folks like you. And we really think that you can't just have a bunch of computer scientists sitting in a room and deciding what will work. That's ridiculous, right? I probably don't need to tell you, but computer scientists are a little bit like physicists. You know, we have a lot of hubris about what our field is capable of and how little we need other fields. But the reality is very different. And being married to a social scientist, I cannot avoid that reality, because if I say bullshit things, pardon my French, I will get excoriated at the dinner table, right? So I have to, it forced me to be a better researcher, thankfully, because I know that, you know, just because you have some algorithm doesn't mean it's actually doing what you think it's doing. So bringing in those collaborations, we think, is really crucial to doing proper work on fairness via AI. And finally, this idea that biased and false information can interact in complex ways. And this can point to the need for studying bias and reducing bias, not just in directly in medicine, but also in other systems that are influenced, such as search engines, social media, and recommender systems. And this is an area of active study by others in the context of fairness, but we think that the biased information is something that's not being addressed in that work, in most of that work. So we posed some open questions, and you'll see we try to answer some of them ourselves in the next paper. But some of the questions we had were, what are effective approaches to identify societal problems that are in most need of and lend themselves to this framework? So think of this almost like a triage, right? Where should we put our energy? What's most urgent? What's most important? And also what will work well with this framework? And then what kind of AI approaches, both existing and novel, do we need to deploy and develop in order to address these problems? And another question is, okay, we're saying we need collaboration, but how do you actually encourage that and infuse the fairness research with them? And I want to mention that fairness work is already quite interdisciplinary. If you have ever gone to FACT, you would know that there's folks from iSchool and social science, humanities, you know, there's philosophers in the room, there's doctors that come there, but we still think that there's more need for a closer coupling of these fields with our work. And then specifically with regards to bisinformation, how and where does it spread, both online and offline? And is it differentially distributed? So for example, if there's a piece of biased information about women, is it more likely to spread among women or among men? Or likewise, if there's a piece of biased information that has a racial bias, is it more likely to spread within that racial group or outside of it? And we think that there might be different types of information spreading differently within or outside the group. And then we also wonder which categories or types of biased or misinfo are most harmful and therefore deserving the most diligent fact-checking and counter-messaging. And that leads us kind of neatly into our next work, which is about to be published in AIES 2024 in just about a month. So those are the collaborators that you saw the photos of earlier. And this paper is specifically looking at the medical curriculum. So, you know, the title is really long, but the salient points here are reducing biases in minoritized populations in the context of medical curricular content. So, you know, in medicine and medical education specifically, there's a long and painful history of both overt and covert, hidden and not so hidden forms of social injustice, including bias and racism. And the American Medical Association made a pledge after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement to confront systemic racism in the practice of medicine. And unfortunately, despite this pledge, the reality is that medical institutions continue to teach biased medicine in preclinical and clinical years. And most educators are not even aware that there is bias in these materials. And therefore, they unknowingly perpetuate this curriculum with adverse effects on health outcomes. And one small point that I don't emphasize here, but my colleague always reminds me, is that it's not just health outcomes that are adversely affected, but also educational outcomes. Because if you are a Black student sitting in a med school and the instructor is giving you this racialized version of medicine, you're going to feel excluded, you're going to feel erased, you're going to feel belittled, and so forth. And this is going to harm your chances of successfully completing the curriculum. So let's dig in a little bit more. What do we mean when we say bias in medical information? And as I promised, there are going to be some examples. So there's a bias and there's also language misuse, and both of them can interact to have detrimental impact on patient outcomes. So inappropriate language or inappropriate use of social identifiers can be harmful even if they're strictly true. So an example that my colleague gives often is, let's say that there's a sentence in your curriculum that says, African Americans have a higher rate of diabetes than white Americans, period, end of story. No citation or anything like that. Okay, so strictly speaking, this sentence is accurate. It's not misinformation, it's true. Okay, there is a higher likelihood of having diabetes if you're Black in America. However, it's not the race that is the causal factor of this likelihood at all, right? It's a lot of other factors, social and structural determinants of health, which are highly associated and more likely to happen to Black people: income inequalities, living in a food desert, lower access to healthcare for preventative care, and the living under the stresses of systemic racism in America. All of these are stressors that are going to increase the odds of anyone to have diabetes, but unfortunately, these are far more likely to happen in Black Americans. Now, if you just present this sentence as is, you're planting this false connection in the brains of the new clinicians, the students, that the race is the cause here. And that's the problem. It's not untrue. The statistics are correct, but you're leading them to draw the wrong conclusions about the reasons. And so we believe that a way that this could be said in the exact same statistics, but in a way that's more beneficial is, for example, if you rewrote that sentence to say exactly what we just said, right? Black Americans are more likely than white Americans to have diabetes due to higher likelihood of problematic social and structural determinants of health, ... citation, 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 right? Show us that you did the work and that this is evidence-based medicine and not just something you pulled out of your hat or handed down generation to generation. Now, this is a case where this is true, but it's even more harmful when the information is actually false in that little intersection with misinfo. So one really terrible example is this long debunked hypothesis called the SOT gene hypothesis. If you haven't heard it, you're not missing much. It's a completely bullshit argument that came up in the late 80s that said that the reason that African Americans have a higher rate of high blood pressure, hypertension, is that there was an evolutionary pressure during the Middle Passage when they came from Africa and during slavery, such that people who had the ability to retain higher salt in their bloodstream were more likely to survive. This claim was debunked almost immediately after it was proposed within a couple of years, there were far more articles showing it was false than there were ever stating that it was true. And it was never actually posited as true. It was posited as a hypothesis that was then disproved. However, this is still being taught in medical schools today. And this is very unfortunate. And by the way, when I started this work, we actually found it on the American Heart Association website, which was shocking. And I deeply believe that I have that screenshot somewhere, but I haven't been able to find it. So hopefully one day I'll find it and I'll be able to show that as well. Now it's been removed, thankfully. So that's no longer there. So what did we set out to do? Knowing that this is happening, right? Our colleagues actually started, before we ever brought in the AI, they actually started working on this project, bias reduction in curricular content, in several different medical schools, initially a pilot study at the Yale School of Medicine, and later with the University of Washington School of Medicine, as well as a few other schools. And really the goal of my colleague, Dr. Montenegro, was to reduce bias in order to teach and practice accurate evidence-based medicine, and reduce this harmful impact on patients and clinicians. And they started doing it by hand, manually, reviewing hundreds and hundreds of materials, thousands of pages. And they trained annotators, and they spent a month training every new annotator, and they did this long consensus process and, created this amazing data set that was all by hand. And even though it's incredibly manual, time-consuming effort, the downstream impact is very large, because you're training a new generation of clinicians to practice better, less biased medicine. And as you know, continuing education exists in medicine, but it's the exception to prove the rule. Doctors are very busy. They don't have time to go and take tons of courses later down the line. So whatever you teach them in med school, that's going to stay with them for the next 30 years. And maybe that can be overcome at a later date, but if you fix it in the source, you're now getting a clinician who has been trained on less biased medicine for the rest of their career to practice better medicine. And at that point, my colleague turned to me. We were friends through my husband. They went to graduate school together in sociology. And he said, hey, we have this really cool project, but it's taking us forever. Can you use AI to help us? And I said, well, do you have data? He said, yeah, we have lots of data. I said, great, then we can help you. To paraphrase the Archimedes, or bastardize the Archimedes quote, give me enough data and I'll move the world. So we were really motivated by this mandate. And most of the data that they have given us is from the University of Washington School of Medicine. And the goal is here to review medical educational content in an automated fashion and flag sentences with biased or potentially biased content. Of course, we do not think that the AI should decide what the curriculum should be, right? That's ridiculous. It's too high stakes. It's too risky. So we don't want that at all, but we want to have this review process where we can focus the experts' energy on examples that are more likely to be biased. And that way will save them a ton of time, right? Because we can just kind of focus their attention on the less than 10% of examples that are actually most likely, and save them a lot of time that way. So this expert in the loop approach means that from a technical standpoint, for those of you who are AI ML folks, we have a preference for higher recall. What that means is that we would rather have false negatives than, false positives than false negatives. So we'd rather flag things that the doctor would say, no, that's not biased, than to miss things that are biased. Because if we go through this process, the experts are not going to review the things that we don't show them. So we do have a preference for these type of errors. And we know that these false positives will subsequently be corrected by the expert review at a later stage. So even a 50% in precision rate would probably yield 90% savings in time by expert annotators, speeding up the process immensely and improving the odds of uptake in additional medical schools, right? Because the process that they did is not replicatable. It's too much time. No medical school in their right mind would say, yeah, sure, I'm going to invest 3 years and 5 research assistants and the time of an attending physician to do this. It doesn't make sense. So pardon me the little bit of technical stuff. So I'm not sure how many of you are AI versus medicine. So I'll do my best not to be too technical and scare you all away. But if I am confusing you, don't hesitate to raise your hand and stop me. I'll happily explain it in more lay terms to make sure that everyone is with me. So in computer science, we have to do these things like we're defining the problem formally. So if we take X to be this excerpt from a text of a medical education, and it could contain a claim, a case report, incident statistics, or really any other content. And T is a social identity. That would be the potential target of bias. That can be gender, race, and so forth. Then the bias of this sentence with respect to this type T is going to be true or false, to saying basically whether this excerpt exhibits bias with respect to that specific identity or not. And by extension, if we have a set of social identities, type 1 through M, we can define a bias of the sentence with respect to all of these identities in the following manner. Pardon the math notation, but the bias of the sentence with respect to all of these types is true if any of the types exhibits bias, right? So it's enough to have one type of bias to mark the sentence as biased with respect to the whole set of types. It doesn't have to be biased in all of them, right? Does this make sense? Okay, great. So with these definitions, we can now define a set of tasks as follows. First, type-specific bias classification. So given a social identity type T and a text X, build me a classifier that will predict whether the sentence is biased with respect to this type or not. And the general bias, give me a set of identities, and now tell me whether this sentence is biased with respect to those identities, any of them, right? So what we need really is, if we have M types of social identities, we need M+1 classifiers, M individual type-specific ones, and 1 for the general type. So, I already mentioned how non-trivial the data collection was, and the data curation, I would say. So this is just one excerpt from the medical experts annotation guideline. The whole guideline is like over 20 pages long with many, many examples and disconfirming examples so that the annotators can check what they're doing against these guidelines. But just to give you a brief explanation here, first, they find out whether there is even any kind of social identifier or reference to a social identifier in this sentence. That can be African-American, Hispanic. It could be reference to gender or sex, age, sexual orientation, ability, stigma, and size. There are many others. Actually, they had so many different types that some of the types only had 1 or 2 examples in the whole corpus. Obviously for machine learning, that's not great. So I'll tell you in a second what we focused on, but they really marked everything. And then they marked 2 more types of things. First, they marked whether the sentence had what they called inappropriate use of language. And this is referring to the way that the claim is phrased, not to the actual content of the claim. So there could be non-patient-centered language, such as injection drug user, alcoholic, and so on. It could be an outdated term like mentally retarded, which is no longer in use. There could be a flip between sex and gender. So they say sex when they mean gender, or they say gender when they mean sex. And there could be age language misuse. For example, older individuals, they prefer, based on the guidelines of University of Washington, they prefer to name the age of the person rather than sort of say, oh, they're older. What does that mean? Are they 50? Are they 70? Are they 89? And so forth. And finally, exclusive language, such as his/her, which doesn't allow for non-binary individuals who use other pronouns. Then they mark it with one of three other labels, which are regarding to the content of the claim and not how the claim is phrased. And those are bias, potential bias, or non-bias. Bias, if they are marking bias or potential bias, they then go further and add a category code such as race, disease, sex, disease, and so on. And they write in an explanation in the annotation. So they might have, for example, in a potential bias, they might say unexplained racial prevalence needs citations. So they're giving a suggestion often on how to rewrite the sentence to make it less biased, if that's possible. And finally, if it's not biased, they still mark it as related, a connection between, for example, race and disease or sex and disease, but it's marked as non-biased relationship. They also have images, but I'm not going to get into that. For this paper, we did not use those. And so in terms of the actual curricula, we had 2 years worth of instructional content, lecture notes, PowerPoint slides, articles, syllabi, and they had thousands of pages overall. And within those pages, we had over 4,000 quotes that were annotated collectively with hundreds of codes, covering a very wide spectrum of biases, as I mentioned. And each quote was annotated by at least 2 medical students, often more, sometimes 4 or more. And they were 4th year and above only, each of which had over a month of training specifically on this annotation guideline. We then had to go and map these codes to machine learning friendly labels, because they were designed by a social scientist without involvement of AI people. So they were kind of messy, right? And for us, we needed things to be much more clear cut. Is it biased? Is it not biased? We needed, something a little bit more clear. So we went through a multi-stage pre-processing procedure, and we were constantly in connection with our experts to make sure that we were accurately representing the meaning of these labels. And then we focused on the most prevalent types of bias, because it's easier to build classifiers when you have a lot of data. So the 6 most prevalent types that we found in this particular data set were gender, sex, race, ethnicity, age, and geography. And we also augmented the set of non-bias examples, which were not that many, because at some point, I think they stopped annotating the non-bias. So we decided to augment them by using a lexicon of social identifiers and mark those sentences as not biased, because we knew that they had gone over every single sentence in the corpus. So we could assume safely that if they hadn't marked it up, that meant that it was not biased. So just visually to see what we did here, our medical experts used Atlas TI to annotate the data. And then, there was sort of a PDF to text conversion that Atlas TI built. Then we created this, what we call the positive bias filter. So in order to find the sentences that were biased, we filtered by anything that had dash disease, race disease, gender disease, and so forth. And that gave us all of the positive bias types and all of the annotated examples with those types. Then we ran a negative bias filter. So from the ones that were actually annotated, we split them into 3 categories. Implicit negatives were the ones that had dash disease, but none of the other bias, potential bias, or non-bias labels. We were told by our collaborators that this meant that they were not biased. So there was a connection in the sentence between, for example, race and disease, but it was not a biased connection. Then there were those that were explicit, so they had dash disease and they had the non-biased label. And finally, there were the remaining negatives, which often had an inappropriate use of language label of some type or another. And then we also extracted these non-annotated negatives as well. And that was using this social identifier type. And finally, we separated all of these by the social identifier type so that every example was marked as which types it is biased with respect to. And I'll show you in a moment some examples. Finally, we did the classical machine learning thing with the k-fold split, but because we have several different types of bias, we did a stratified split to make sure that the types of bias were distributed between the folds. Okay, so let's dig into the examples. This is the fun part, right? So here are some, well, it's not fun, obviously, because they're biased, but in terms of like, this is the interesting part, right? So here are some sample bias quotes. I will kind of briefly read them out to you. So gender type quote, often significant changes in a child's growth reflect significant events in the family unit, such as a mother going to work, blah, blah, blah. Annotator comments, this statement reinforces traditional family structures which stigmatize mothers going to work or families without a mother or two mothers. Consider omitting gendered clause. So this was marked as biased. Or I don't know actually offhand, but either biased or potentially biased. Here's an example of sex. Most common in adolescent females with BMI over 30, often treated with blah, 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 and a weight loss program. Annotator comment, consider addressing why weight and sex are relevant factors here. Does being female predispose a patient to idiopathic intracranial hypertension? And if so, providing a citation prevents interpretation as biased. Notice that the annotators are very gentle here. They're super soft, right? Because they're students providing these feedback to their professors. And so they're being like, kind of walking on eggshells, like, consider this, look at that, maybe, so they're being very deferential, if you will. Here's an example by the way, this one was also marked on weight, but we didn't have enough examples, so we didn't attack weight in this particular paper. Race, although the incidence is lower in patients of color, the mortality can often be higher. Annotator comment, no source for claim, consider explaining more beyond patients of color, as this may come across as grouping every minority group into one and making a generalized statement. Ethnicity, the components of genetic versus environmental risk has not been fully established, but note the increased incidence of colorectal cancer in the Alaskan Native population. Comment is include citations, stratify why its Alaskan Native population is disproportionately affected, and so forth. Just briefly, new onset solid food dysphagia in anyone over 40, ... Is this a medical fact regarding this age group? Geography, had any other members suffered the same symptoms in Brazil or after returning? No significance of Brazil indicated in the case study. Now let me show you some non-biased types, right? And again, ask me anything, so stop me at any time. Here's a quote that is non-biased with respect to sex. In 1971, Reisman and Field reported that female rats had more dendritic spines, ... This one was marked as an explicit negative. It was marked as non-biased by the annotators with respect to sex. For age, in general, trends attributed to colorectal cancer screening in patients over 50, ... This one was explicit. For geography, oral and oropharyngeal cancer is diagnosed each year in 40,000 Americans. This one was implicit, so there was a geography disease label, but not a non-biased label, but also not a bias or potential bias label. For sex, the idea that some adult behavior is influenced by sex steroidal milieu during development had origins in a classic study, ... This was an implicit negative. And then here's an example of race that was extracted. Emergency department physicians generally prescribe fewer opioids to African Americans, regardless of clinical disorder and presentation, than to non-Hispanic whites. And there was a citation to the to back this claim up. So you can see that this is referring to African Americans, but it's really, in a way, it's criticizing this bias as opposed to just accepting it as accurate, right? So this was an extracted negative. It was not annotated at all, but we were able to determine that it was not biased based on the fact that it was not annotated and it contained these references. And similarly for gender, physical exam shows a woman in moderate distress. Nothing here that to be concerned about. And finally, here's an example of inappropriate use of language, these sort of remaining negatives. His actions were impulsive, ... report suggesting he became an alcoholic and drifter. And this was labeled by the annotators as non-patient-centered language. But as you can see, there is no bias per se, right? It's not biased with respect to that. It's just stigmatizing the patient. Okay, so I'm running a little low on time, but hopefully we have time for the discussion. So I want to make sure we leave that. So here's some characteristics of the data set. We had 509 PDF files, over 12,000 total pages, 4,100 annotated excerpts, 1,300 annotated positives, almost 3,000 annotated negatives, and then an additional 4,300, 4,400 extracted negatives. And here is this cool diagram that I didn't know about when we started this paper. It's called an upset diagram, and it shows you the incidence of all of these biased quotes and how sometimes they're overlapping. So you can see that overall age was actually the most labeled bias, then followed by sex, gender, geography, race, and finally ethnicity. This is the one on the top here. You're seeing the ones that are only age without any other type, only sex, and so on. And you can see the numbers dropping slightly. Whereas you have these intersections, and you can see that, for example, age and sex were the most common overlap. So the same sentence had both sex and age bias. Then race and ethnicity was the next up, and followed by age and gender, and then a bunch of smaller incidence ones. But you can see that almost all of them had some overlap, and then we had some that had 3 different types in one sentence. Okay, so as we said, we have 7 different tasks. I won't get into the math. We can skip that, but if you're interested, I can refer you to the paper. And so we had a few different strategies to build the classifiers. First, 7 different binary types, 1 for each type, and 1 for the general bias detection. Then we did something called an ensemble, which means that we took the bias-specific ones and we combined them. We took the output of the bias-specific types and combined them, not with machine learning, but with just a simple OR. So if any of the independent types were biased, we just said that the whole sentence was biased. And finally, we tried a multitask learner, where you're trying to train the model to simultaneously detect all the different types and the general bias all in one classifier. And again, I'll skip over some of the details, but we tried a few different combinations of the negative set because we weren't sure which of these would be the most effective to train the model. So we kind of messed around with several different combinations to see which would be most effective. And finally, we trained these models. So the binary classifier is pretty straightforward. We were using fine-tuned Distilbert here. We definitely want to expand this to using the latest generation large language models, but it was, for compute reasons, we decided to go with Distilbert for this paper. And then we averaged, we ran it on each of the folds, averaged the metrics. Ensemble, as I said, we take every one of these, we ran them on all the sentences, and then for each sentence, we just go okay, is any one of these biased? If so, the whole thing is biased. And finally, here we have multiple, tasks. We have a dense layer with the task-specific heads and a fully connected output layer that then leads to gender, sex, race, ethnicity, and the general type. So this is a computer science paper, so there's a lot of numbers and things, but feel free to skip over this if it's not interesting to you. Some of the more relevant kind of high notes are that training with only the extracted negative category yielded a much higher recall than precision. So we had a lot of those false positives more than the false negatives, but that leads to a low F1 score. When we tried to use all the negatives versus taking out those inappropriate use of language, we found it to be almost the same. But the all negatives had a slightly higher or equal AUC, which you can think of as accuracy under a data set that is not balanced. So we had a lot more negative examples than positive examples, which is reassuring. At least we know that not everything in this curricula is biased, right? But because that data is in balance, and AUC is the best metric to figure out whether we're doing well. And you can see here that we are actually doing quite well with respect to gender and race, sex. We had essentially close to 90% accuracy or higher, sometimes even 95. Which was very reassuring, but F scores are not as high. So there's some interesting, conversations that a computer scientist can have with me. But if you're not interested, for the interest of time, I'll skip over that. And just one more thing to note is that we calculated an F2 score, which is not usually traditional, but it is more appropriate in cases where you care more about recall than precision. So F is usually the harmonic mean of precision and recall, but F1 measures them equally, whereas F2 gives recall twice as much weight as precision in the harmonic mean. So again, nerding out, I can nerd out all day, but I want to make sure this is interesting to those of you who are not interested in that kind of thing. And again, this was, by the way, still for the type-specific bias. When we varied the classifier type, we found that both the type-specific and the multitask model greatly outperformed a baseline that was not fine-tuned. The multitask learning often led to the best precision, but the binary classifier tended to outperform in all of the other metrics. And the AUC again was quite high, from 89 to 95%, so pretty effective. And when we went to the general bias type, we also tried these different variations. Again, there were some small differences. We later found that there is some problem with the extracted negatives. So we're actually working now on a revision, perhaps for a journal version of the paper that will improve this problem. So the part of the problem that we found was that the extracted negative, we were using a lexicon. So we were using words to indicate social identity. But some of the words can be used in other contexts that are not related to the social identity. So for example, black and white aren't always signifiers of race. Sometimes the sentence says, the black dot in the picture means blah, 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 or white brain cells, ... And so now we are actually applying word sense disambiguation to make sure that when we extract the negatives, they're actually referring to the social identifier and not just to the word around it. So, in general, there were not that many differences, but you can see here in this ROC curve. So just for those of you not familiar, we have the false positive rate on the x-axis and true positive rate on the y-axis. So the gray line is if you gave them random scores. And basically you always want to be above the gray line, right? If you're below the gray line, you might as well flip a coin, you'll do better. But if you're above the gray line, the question is, how far are you close to the sort of straight line above it, right? You want to be as close as possible because that indicates that as the false positive rate goes up, the true positive rate stays high until you finally reach a point where you end up when the false positive rate is 100% true. You're basically labeling everything as true, and here you're labeling everything as false. So you're always going to have 0 on both edges. The question is your curve closer to the straight line or not? So you can see here that the baseline is far below, and the colored areas, the shaded areas, are showing you the sort of error bars. And you can see that the lines from general and multitask are very, very similar. Here for the general bias detection, the general classifier on all of the negatives did a little bit better. And if you remove the remaining negatives, they again perform very similarly. The ensemble, by the way, cannot be mapped because it doesn't provide probabilities. It's just a true false. So you can see here that the binary general classifier is definitely the better one, especially in this setting, but overall they're very similar. So hope I didn't put you all to sleep with those details, but if you're still with me, let's kind of zoom out on the so what. We provide several different contributions. First, a large, highly curated data set on bias in medical education, which as far as we know is actually the first of its kind. We also provide a first-in-class detection classifier for bias in medical text. We introduced this methodology for fairness via AI, combining modern AI techniques with a rich and deep understanding of social challenges and medical educational material. And our proposed method can detect biased content quite well, greater than 90% in most cases. And, as we mentioned before, we also introduced biased information, especially in the context of medical. And, if we zoom out even further, like, what do I hope that you take away from this talk? Not just the details of our particular paper, but this encouragement to think bigger with this fairness via AI approach. And channel your efforts not just to make AI fairer, but really make the world fairer and accelerate this social progress rather than a bias in, bias out approach. I don't need to tell you all that we should collaborate with experts outside of computing, but when I give this talk to computing audiences, I really drive this point home because a lot of them don't even try. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm open to any questions and comments, thoughts.
First of all, thank you, Shiri, for this fascinating talk, and I think that really interesting stuff that you're doing. And while I do have one question, I think that first of all, we're gonna open it for guests. So please, first of all of you, feel free to open your cameras, and then if you've got something to ask, go ahead.
Thanks, Amir. I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone.
I know that there are some folks in the audience that are really interested in this specific topic. So yeah.
Yeah, hi Shiri. Thanks for the talk. I just had a quick question about the different classifiers. Like, my intuition says that maybe it should be the multitask learning should be the best because it should learn kind of the general space of bias. So do you have a sense for why actually the binaries perform better, or do you have like further work, other architectures to try there?
Yeah, we have some hypotheses. We don't know for sure why exactly it's not performing as well. We also hypothesized that it would do better than it actually did, or at least better than the binaries. We think it might be that some of the bias types are very related to each other and some of them are not. So it's possible that there is some kind of confounding nature. If you throw in the age and the geography along with the sex and the gender, it might be like, oh, what's happening? I don't understand. And maybe, one thing we do want to try is, would it be more effective, for example, to run a separate multitask learner on, say, geography, ethnicity, and race, and a separate one on sex and gender, and not have all the different types in one big happy pile, because they might be kind of confusing the model. Wait, it looks like this here, but looks like that over there. I don't get it. So, we didn't have enough time to try all the different combinations. And also at some point you have to be careful, because you're sort of not exactly p-hacking, but you know what I mean? Like if you're trying 17 million combinations, you're risking that you're really overfitting to the data set. So we definitely want to keep exploring this space and trying that. And I also think that honestly, like using a foundation model that's more advanced than BERT is probably going to get better results on a multitask learning than what we have here. Because right now we're still using sort of like older gen technology. And, some of my students are like deep in the weeds of ChatGPT APIs and things, and others are still catching up. So we do think that probably a foundation model would perform better overall. And we also think that the results were a little bit inflated because of this word sense disambiguation issue. So, they're almost too good, right? They're not quite like 99.99, in which case I'd be like, hey, you have a bug in the code for sure. But they were high enough that it prompted us to kind of look at the data manually. And that's when we found the word sense disambiguation issue. I don't think it's a deal breaker. It just means that we're giving it examples that are negative, that are a little bit too easy. So if we really want to kind of find out if it's successful, we should not be looking at those examples where it says the white dot on the picture indicates blah blah, right? So thankfully we're just had some undergrads who spent their summer working on this, and we found that even when you removed those examples, the classifier still did really well. So that's encouraging.
Great, thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, thanks for the great question.
So Shiri, I was wondering, so you mentioned one big happy pile. I want to maybe refer to the general picture. So I think one thought I had in mind was that, assuming this works nicely, I mean, it seems to be looking at sentences, maybe at a little bigger context that this sentence is appearing at, and by that kind of trying to find whether or not it is potentially biased. Looking at the bigger pile or the bigger context would be, for instance, I could write a book that passes all of these exams with flying colors. It would have 3 lines about one group and gazillion lines about another group, and thus maybe underrepresent this group, or so on. So what I'm saying is that it would seem that it's giving I mean, it's a great start, but I would wonder whether there's also another way of looking at the bigger picture as well, or like, is that something you're considering as well?
Yeah, so let me make sure I understand you correctly. If I'm hearing you right, you're saying that there's an issue of representation in terms of volume, not just what the sentence actually says.
I mean, all the sentences could be wonderful.
Yes,
The general
100%.
story that one would hear would be a certain story that may be biased in a way, or
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And this is actually a finding of our colleagues in the text, that there is a problem of representation, and not just of the case studies and the patient stories, but also of the providers. So when there are photos of patients, they are of all different kind of races and ethnicities and genders, but when there's providers, they're almost always pictured as white. So this is just one example. You're absolutely right that this representation is a big issue. And, part of the reason that they were going through and marking the examples even when there was no bias, but marking them as race after disease, we kind of skipped over it. But, I mentioned that they've had hundreds of codes from the actual text. So yeah, my student has an example. I should add it to the slides actually, where you have a snapshot, like a screenshot from the Atlas TI, and then you can see that for every sentence they labeled them with like sometimes 3, 5, 7, 10 codes. So for example, a sentence might be labeled with bias and race-disease, but it will also be labeled with African American or woman or whatever the identity itself actually is. And the benefit there is that you can actually go through and count that incidence, right? You can sort of do that analysis of the prevalence. We definitely didn't address that in this paper, but we do think it's a very important problem that we want to make sure we look at in the future. And I appreciate you reminding me of it because I haven't thought about that in a while. But we've talked about it for sure. And I think that there are all sorts of, weird and strange and horrifying examples in that my colleague has pointed out to us. For example, in the pictures of white patients, often the whole person is shown. But when they're presenting cases of African Americans, often they only have a picture of the body part. So there's a dehumanizing element here. And this is really subtle, right? You have to be paying attention to the holistic context in which this is happening. So I think that, yes, like my answer is yes, we should do that. No, we haven't done it yet, but definitely, let's say, future work.
I'd say we have, when I look at the people in this call, we have experts on decision-making, shared decision-making, legal experts, and people in other fields as well. So I'm kind of hoping that people would get the courage to kind of share their thoughts.
I'm also mindful that it's late afternoon and not everybody might have had their afternoon coffee yet. So,
Shiri, I was wondering, like, as a person that is coming from the disability field, to what extent do you think about adding the specific bias to your work?
yeah, thanks, Amir. So for those who don't know, I have multiple chronic illnesses and I identify as disabled. My disabilities are largely invisible, but not imaginary, as the T-shirt kind of quips. So I actually founded an org recently called Disabled in Computing. We were kind of a meeting zone for folks with all disabilities, and I'm very proud of this bag that I hand lettered, nothing about us without us. Yeah, I think it's definitely influenced my views, and I think that, yeah, there's definitely disability bias that they are marking in the text, and stigma, especially in the mental health space. They have very extensive they said some of the most gender biased modules were the mental health modules, for example, where there was sort of these like spurious associations that they made between like hypersexualized images to present certain personality disorders and stuff like that, like very problematic images and content. I think it's sort of like inevitable that my lived experience is impacting my interest in this topic, but I'm not sure yet how exactly it's gonna be coming into play, other than just like bringing that perspective, if that makes sense. In a perfect world, I would have a brilliant plan for how my disabilities and disabilities in general would interact with this work, but if you have any ideas, definitely let me know.
I actually wanted to share something. So, like some years ago, so I'm also a lawyer. I don't do much consulting work, but I was asked to consult on a case where there was an expert opinion by a psychiatrist. So you mentioned bias in mental health, and I was helping to carve out the cross-examination. And the expert was kind of evaluating a male and a female in a quarrel they had in court. So she had to kind of evaluate each of them and in relation to custody and so on. And the majority, like a part of what I did was to ask two of my research assistants to do something similar to what you've talked about, which is actually to do a text analysis for biases in the very lengthy kind of opinion she submitted to court, the psychiatrist. So a part of that was just, how long the text was, like why would, one of them get 6 lines, the other 2 pages for the same type of whatever status. Why were the claims that the male had presented as facts and the claims that the woman had presented as according to her version? And so this was, so evident, right? Now, theoretically, what she wrote about her was not biased, but if you compare it to what you wrote about him, then it becomes biased. Now, this is context-related bias, so it has to be measured by the overall context, which in this case is a forensic medical report rather than a regular, textbook. So I'm just, obviously the work you've done is more general in nature, so it looks at the general textbooks, but I'm just thinking the implications and the use of what you're doing. Imagine, let's say that this expert didn't do it on purpose. I'm not saying that she didn't, right? But maybe still she was very much biased, right? A bias is not supposed to be intentional, right? Otherwise it's
Right.
not really a bias. It's intentional, right?
Right.
So here's the thing. I think if people don't want to be biased, then one thing would be in curricula. Another would be if you have this tool and you make it accessible, then when people write their opinions, they write their whatever, it can go through this system and they get a chance to kind of reorganize their thoughts around the text and ask themselves hard questions where nobody else needs to know that they feel outdated and the language has changed.
Yeah.
I heard several versions about whether or not the word African American is acceptable anymore, or one should only say black, or now seriously, if the language has changed or what's acceptable as not discriminatory has changed, and somebody didn't get the memo, and I'm trying not to be funny about it.
No.
They're not offensive on purpose. Now, if the text you measured are from 10 years ago, doesn't it mean then that some of the words are just
there are some anachronisms here, and
okay, I'm sorry, it's a lot of thoughts.
No, I agree with you. I'm agreeing completely. Yes, I love the example, and I'm probably going to steal it if that's okay in some
Sure,
future.
just
Well,
just
in some
write me
future
back, I'll let
paper
you
where I
rhyme.
talk about the prevalence, maybe I'll use your story. But I think you're absolutely right. And then we are also interested in sort of like in this paper, we really focused on the excerpts that as labeled by the annotators and really at the sentence level. But I do believe that there are some cases where you can't just look at the sentence granularity and you have to see it in the context of where it is. For example, exactly in the mental health space, I think some of the slides would be in and of themselves just fine, except for when you look at the whole presentation that my colleague shared with us, you can see that they're bracketing the different personality disorders into gendered buckets. And when you're looking at all the case studies on antisocial personality disorder are all about men, and all the case studies of borderline personality are all about women, then you start getting that sense that there's a bias here beyond any particular sentence. So I agree with you. There's a lot of nuance here. The other thing that came to mind as you were saying that, it brought a memory back that I haven't thought about in a while, but there was some engine that probably is still available for hiring ads where you could they were analyzing like software engineering jobs, and they saw that there were ads that said ninja and coder and like whatever accelerate, and those were sort of more likely to be applied to by men, and others that had more team collaboration were more like likely to be applied or filled with women. And so you could actually go and run your job ad before you publish it. You could just run it through their website and get a rewrite suggestion. So I think that you're onto something, right? I don't know that I would necessarily want to be the one providing this myself, because I would feel uncomfortable, you know. I think the potential for misuse, especially in the medical case, is pretty rife. Like when, you know, publish this in AIES, and AIES asks you for like an ethical statement, and how could this be taken out of context? And like one of my colleagues' biggest concerns is that it could be used to score doctors and then to punish them for being biased, right? Where in reality, you know, the lower resources your school has, the less time you have to go through your text and go back and make sure that you're not biased and all that. And so he wants to make sure that people aren't penalized for having this you know, leftover slides with some crappy thing that somebody said 20 years ago, and you just haven't even had the time to correct it in your slides. And without having a training session for the doctors to explain to them why this is biased and how could they fix it, and giving them the resource and time, it could very easily be taken out of context as like this punitive measure, like, oh, if your curriculum, you know, if your educational material is biased, you're going to get deducted, you know, 10% of your salary or whatever for this year, no bonus for you or whatever, right? So this is like definitely a misuse that we wouldn't want, because we think that the goal should be to use this in concert with education of the doctors, right? A professional development setting, and also given the resources to actually fix it, you know, maybe time, right? Or payment for that extra effort. So I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. Just one thought that I've been having all the time. So you're basically talking about qualitative analysis in a way, because we're looking at narrative, we're looking at text. We have live judges who are judging the text and seeing categories and seeing, you know, you can define and so there's always this maybe not personal but subjective element that is always there when we do kind of a narrative textual analysis. We can judge it with several people, we can try to reach kind of consensus, but I guess that's the underlying issue with this kind of research, that is easy to be looked at as far from being accurate, you know, science. But it relates to a social issue and so on, so it makes sense. Now,
Careful, don't say that in front of any social scientists.
no, I'm saying it because
right?
I think
so they use a method called content analysis, which is highly
Yeah.
validated, right? So even though it's qualitative in nature, it doesn't mean that it's not replicatable. So that's part of why the guidelines are very detailed.
yeah, I know, but what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say
Yeah, go
here,
ahead.
like the second part is, thank you for answering, because I forgot what was my second part, right? Because in the medical faculty as well, it took time to allow this, to have room for this, right? There's like, do serious research. I mean, all this qualitative, we're not sure where it should fit. And over time, I think, especially today with AI, people, I mean, NLP and so on, it's like, oh, wow, it's really important to do this. It's like, right? So I think something amazing happened over the past 2 years. So people are rethinking all this qualitative research and seeing how important it is today. So what I had in mind is that people would say, well, look, so we're talking about this important issue of bias and potentially of discrimination. We have anti-discrimination laws. We want to avoid bias, but how do you operationalize this concept, and how can we be sure this is not Shiri's and her staff's values that are imposed on others when they tell us this is okay, this is not okay, this is offensive, this is not offensive. And I'll just give the example that I heard, and I'm not sure. So you talked about the use of alcohol or alcoholism as potentially offensive. And I'm thinking about...
And yeah, I just want to clarify. Yeah, okay, go
No,
finish.
and I'm
doing
saying,
the
well, so
Israeli thing of like, wait.
no, it's good. Because I mean, so like when we meet patients, in my capacity where I meet patients, sometimes a lot of them, like maybe 50% of these psychiatric patients that I have a chance to meet, they also have substance use disorder. It could be alcohol, it could be other kinds of drugs. A lot of times it's a combination. And many times they're very much dependent. So it's not like they use it once in a while. It's not recreational, like once a week, but more like a daily abuse and so on. And when sometimes the psychiatrists confront them with a harsh word like, so you're basically a narcoman, you're basically a drug user, some just hate
They
this
wake up,
word.
yeah.
They feel very much offended. No, I'm not. I mean, I can stop anytime and so on. Others, they get this, yeah, I guess I am, right?
Wake up call.
So I'm just saying, it's like,
I hear you. But notice that when you introduced them, you said they have a substance use disorder.
yeah. So I mean, so you can
So I
use
think,
this
I
word,
think,
but
I
you
think
tell
that,
it, wait, this word is nice. It's like clinical, but you're talking to a person. When you
right,
use
right,
those
right.
clinical
But I
terms,
think it's different when you're talking to the patient versus when you are, teaching new clinicians about it, right? And that's really what they're saying. And by the way, you mentioned Shiri and staff values, but keep in mind that they were using the University of Washington clinical guidelines, their School of Medicine clinical guidelines on best practices, right? So it's not kind of coming from their own, pulled out of thin air hat. Like, so for example, this non-patient centered language is part of the UW School of Medicine guidelines. Also the age-related things, the weight-related stuff, which we didn't talk about in this paper, but those were all coming from the clinical guidelines. And, I've given this talk now in a few different places in Israel, and including in person and online. And, the first time I gave it, there was a very famous, head of department in Rambam, came in and was like, but what about, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We need race in medicine. It's important. And I was like, yeah. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not saying you should be colorblind or gender blind or anything like that. That's ridiculous. And it's actually actively harmful. If you're pretending that you're colorblind, then you're probably more racist than otherwise. If you admit that you're racist, that's the first step to being less racist, right? But I think that the crucial thing is that if you're saying something and it's evidence-based, that's fine. If you want to talk about race and you have the gushpanka, you have the citations to prove it, great. But when you're asking like, how do we know it's not it's super subjective? I mean, there were some cases. So the protocol of the annotation was I think very interesting. They each annotated separately, then they met in pairs and they compared notes and they shifted the guidelines all through this content analysis process, which is very well established. But one of the things that happened was sometimes they couldn't reach a consensus, and then they would escalate it to the other team of two, and they would talk about it and compare notes, and sometimes they still couldn't agree, and then they would escalate it to the attending physicians, my colleague Roberta, and he told me sometimes he had to do a 4-hour lit review just to figure out if one sentence was biased or not, because
these are the most important. So that's what I had in mind. Like, I think
because
these cases, I would collect
some
those.
claim about kidney function in African Americans. Like, well, I don't know if it's true or not. How am I going to find out? So he would go and do the lit review to see whether it was backed up in the evidence or not. And the other thing, I think it's slipping my mind. No, don't go. There was one other thing related to that, which is escaping me. But if it comes back, I'll tell you.
It will come back. We are sure of that.
But probably after we're done, and then I'll be like, damn it.
We'll add it by AI.
I really appreciate the questions. It's a really, it's a very hard to sometimes to explain all these nuances in a concise way. And I think it's a valid concern, right? Just the whether it's like, is this something objective? But inter-annotator disagreement is like normal. So I was raised in the information retrieval community, which is like sibling of NLP and machine learning. But its own thing, like search engines, right? And when you have search engines, the truth is a relevance judgment. So did I issue a query? Did the documents you gave me, are they relevant or not? And humans disagree on relevance 20% of the time. Like, there is no like universal thing where you can just say, oh, this is clearly relevant to this query. If you give any two people a list of queries and a list of documents, the max you'll ever get is 80% agreement. So I think that it's normal to have some human variation, that's to be expected, right? Part of why we also want the human to review the results in the end, and preferably the actual physician who's teaching the class.
Right. So do you have a vision? Like, where do you see this going in 5 years?
Yeah, so the vision is my colleagues, and I share it. I love it. The vision is, yeah, like we have a software and a training protocol that then he goes around and trains med schools around the country to incorporate this, and then hands them the software and says, okay, go to town. And then if you have questions, come back to us, we'll help you, etc. You know, really trying to not just operationalize it in research papers, but really take it to the next level and make it put it into practice and debias the curriculum, right? That's
Right.
that would
Right
be
now
the
it's in
dream.
English. It's right now in English.
Right now in
the
English,
American curriculum.
yeah, English and specifically American English. I wouldn't want to just then throw it on the UK and assume that it would work, or India or whatever. But I think like even within that, it would be probably very interesting to see whether there would be uptake for this. And then in terms of the software, is nowhere near where I want it to be, because it's not enough to just have these models. You have to be able to display them in a visually appealing way so that it's easy for the doctor to say thumbs up, thumbs down. The other things we want eventually is to have some kind of explainable AI that says, this is why this is biased. It's like, here are the 2 words that are most problematic in this sentence, and perhaps offer a rewrite that says, here's a suggested rewrite. Now you can accept it, you can edit it, you can change it, depending on what you think, the doctor. So we're trying to take the inspiration. I mean, you're a lawyer, but the technology assisted review from the e-discovery world is like the model that we're thinking of, where you really have a workflow with an expert that costs more money, an expert that costs less money, and you're starting it with your, you know, maybe like your residents or even your trainees, and then you escalate it if you're not sure, and then the attending can come in and just fix like 5 sentences and be done with his day, because that's all he has time, he or she, they have time for, and so forth. You know, that would be the dream. But I think that also without the educational part, it's not going to mean anything, because if you fix the slides and then the professor comes in and says the bullshit bias thing anyway out loud, then you did nothing, right? So it's not enough to just have it be like, oh, the AI will fix it for you. No.
So basically, if the professor is involved with the process of building this, then during the process of machine learning, there's also human learning and kind of cross-learning, like learning together, right? The machine provides with suggestions, you think about it, say, that makes sense.
And ideally, the feedback from the doctors gets incorporated into the model over time. The model can improve and do better, right? And it's possible that the doctor is just racist and they will reject all the suggestions. So we have to be a little careful, like just because they reject it doesn't mean it was wrong, just maybe that, you know, trying to understand what the motivation of the rejection.
Were there other biases that you consider incorporating? And because you said sex and gender and race.
Yeah.
And
Oh my God, they had so many. They had weight and religion, socioeconomic status, and immigrant status, language use, like if they were speaking a certain language. For example, there is this like one case where, you know, a Vietnamese speaking 70-year-old patient, and you're like, why does it matter that she speaks Vietnamese? Like you said about the prevalence, like, is it even relevant? Like, why would you even mention it? Unless you're saying that she needs an interpreter, okay, then fine. But it's kind of like, you know, so there are a lot of these examples that are really like kind of head scratching, if you will. But I think that the biggest barrier for us is scale. If we only have like 10 examples in the whole corpus, how am I going to train a machine learning model to detect them, right? So I think there's a trickiness in terms of getting more, and hopefully if there is uptake, then we would have more data from these schools that would maybe adopt this approach, and then that would give us more to train on and so forth.
So my thought, which is easy to offer because I'm not doing the work. So assuming you want something similar to happen in other languages, maybe other countries and so on, then over time, if there are going to be teams working in other countries on building, which is a lot of work, because, you know, starting from scratch in a way, then what you would have at some point is more examples to specific biases where you have not got enough examples in English. You'll take the Hebrew or the Arabic or the Spanish,
and then use
whatever,
a
translate it.
multilingual foundation model to figure it out. Yeah, I agree. I think that would be really cool. And if anyone wants to take that ball and run with it in Israel, I'd be more than happy to collaborate. And you know, it is a pretty significant investment. And I mean, we didn't even mention all of the annotators as co-authors. They weren't, half of them were not even paid. They were like volunteering because they wanted the curriculum to be less biased, and they felt very strongly about it. And so, you know, they're all in our paper's acknowledgements, but we couldn't possibly make them all co-authors because then we'd have like 17 authors instead of 7.
Yeah, you know, Daphna wrote, I think she's not, I mean, Daphna Kila wrote that it may be interesting to look at the intersection of AI, epistemology, and marginalized groups. Now,
yeah, definitely.
I know very little about
I'd love to hear more about what you mean by that.
Well, so you know, so I know very little about epistemology. It's a field in philosophy, but also in psychology or neuropsychology. It looks at how we think about the world and how our thinking process goes and so on. Right now, I was wondering in this regard, to some extent, I would, you know, if we just put out a survey to medical students in, let's say, in clinical years or I don't know, at a certain point, what have you any experience of feeling of bias material during your studies? Can you give examples? It would be interesting to actually to start there. Like what I mean, in a way, what comes to
that is, I think, where it started from, right? Like I think, you know, my colleague who is Latino had so many different horrible experiences during his own medical journey, medical school journey. And that was, I think, the impetus, like the seed of this dream to deracialize.
But at the same time, I think, I mean, that kind of connects to one's personal experiences as well. So I think prior experiences of a person being marginalized or being disregarded and so on might also create, let's say, a higher potential to identify potential bias where it's not, you know, necessarily what the intended meaning was. And so one may assume that giving a certain example was done for the wrong reasons. And I guess these are where it's a discussion to be made, to be done, because if that person feels that the horrible example was given for no good reason, and maybe there was a good reason, but this lack of communication, just the person would stay with that feeling that, well, what can I say? I have to be quiet because what am I going to say? I'm going to look like the person who complains all the time. And so I'm just wondering if you, it's more of a personal experience.
I'm curious if Daphna is still, I see her box on the Zoom, but I don't know if she can tune in.
Daphna, you're there. I'm sorry, I didn't see that you're still, if you were with us, please let us know your thoughts. I'm sorry. Yeah, because, you're muted. Can you unmute?
Yeah. My thoughts is about knowledge, which is epistemology is the way that we gain knowledge. And in the current AI-related perspective, it's a very different way to gain knowledge. And I thought that marginalized people, there is a field in epistemology that talks about marginalized group, mainly about feminist experiences. And that because they are marginalized, actually they have access to knowledge that other people or the mainstream would not have. And I thought about how can we use this perspective in order to access knowledge, or that AI will be considering in some way such connection, such knowledge.
I love it. I was wondering if that was what you were going for. And I'm a little bit familiar. I'm definitely not an expert in any way, but, also with the indigenous epistemologies, I know is another example where sort of native ways of knowing that are foreign to many others. So I think I haven't thought about it too much in the context of this particular paper, but I am working. I'll use this as a shameless plug for a different paper that we're currently working on with a set of pretty awesome collaborators on criticizing some of the artificial general intelligence discourse and this idea that you're going to build some AI that will be smarter than humans in every way and blah, 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 blah. And so we're not the first, nor will we be the last to criticize this idea. But what we're trying to do is to provide a positive alternative. Because it's like, well, if you hate AGI, then what's left for you? There's nothing right now that you can say, oh, I don't want to build AGI. I want to build this thing instead. So we're calling it expansive AI, and it's exactly looking at these kinds of things and how do we build broad participation from multiple disciplines, from multiple communities and populations that normally would be marginalized in this process and that are underrepresented, for example, in tech. And also, have collective legitimacy as opposed to being something that is just imposed on the entire population by some Silicon Valley dude bros, if you will, and so, our thinking is exactly that there's a lot of rich work on different epistemologies and how they are sidelined in AI and they're not being utilized. And I think my hope is that we actually use this paper as a case study, this bias reduction paper as a case study of how you could actually build AI that is for the betterment of humanity and not in the cliched Silicon Valley sense of make the world a better place, but actually harm reduction and being mindful of these detrimental effects that you're having on other communities that aren't going to get a say unless we give them a say, right? So I think in this paper, we didn't really engage with community organizations or grassroots folks because we already have sort of, maybe we will at some point, we have some connections there, but in a different project that I have with some of the same collaborators, we are working on misinformation mitigation in Asian American Pacific Islander communities. And there, we are, having this participatory element with 4 community orgs on the ground that are sharing with us what their needs are and what they're facing that is very traditionally ignored in mainstream misinfo mitigation efforts. So helping them and building tools that are AI powered for their needs and not for what we think their needs are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, so there was a paper in American Journal of Bioethics not long ago. I looked at the epistemology of lived experience. I mean, what would be the benefits and also the risks? If you want to use the data that relates to lived experience, it could be of neurodivergent, it could be of the female experience or specific women at risk and so on. The one hand, it provides you with specific knowledge that others might not have, access to knowledge of experience. On the other hand, one might say that bias relates to the fact that I have a specific experience that kind of takes my vision to what I've experienced. So the question is whether it should be as part of the training material, so kind of give lived experience of different types of different experiences, so the model knows of different experiences and not just have the experience of the more prevalent use cases that appear in the material. Or should we have people who've experienced different things in the team that tags and makes decisions about what it means? I mean, so I'm saying the bias could be in different ways. It could be because I've experienced something, I'm more capable of seeing it, but maybe I'm too capable of seeing it to some extent. And that's, I see it even where others
Seeing
maybe,
patterns, but there are none.
and it's very hard to say what I'm saying, because then, well, it means you don't understand those people, whoever these people are. And I think that's the biggest challenge, isn't it? Like, how do you incorporate?
It's one challenge. I saw Mir smiling. It actually connects to his earlier question about my lived experience with disabilities. I mean, I see it all the time in the context of, you mentioned neurodivergence. I think it's really important. I have ADHD, but because of my kind of activity in the disability community, I've come across many patient advocates who are autistic and identify as such. I think that, like, there is a lot that mainstream medical practice is not ready for yet, right? I mean, this whole argument about self-DX, which I just wrote about in the WhatsApp group that I think many of you are in it, earlier last night, I think, and Yafit wrote back to me, and we ended up in like a 20-minute WhatsApp conversation about that, because I think that the vast majority of doctors would say self-DX is bullshit. Self-diagnosis is, oh, all these patients going to Dr. Google, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's not my lived experience at all, because I'm a zebra. If you know the adage about when you hear hoofbeats, I have several rare diseases, and the way that I found out that I have rare diseases is because somebody tweeted about those diseases, and I was like, wait, I have that one. Wait, I have that one too. And, the average doctor would be like, oh, whatever, she's just bullshitting. But the reality is that 21 months later, one of those self-diagnoses was finally validated by the mainstream medical profession. The other one, from the same tweet, by the way, there were 3 medical issues listed in the same tweet. I was like, I have this one, I have this one. Oh, thank God I don't have that one. It turns out the second one, I'm still waiting. And it's been like almost 2 years now, and probably be waiting for quite some more time. So, that's one thing. The other thing is, in the context of autistic adults especially, there are some real risks to formal diagnosis that are ignored by most medical professionals. There's a risk of essentially being dismissed by the medical profession for your very real medical issues, because, well, you're autistic, so it's all in your head, and you're not really feeling these things. And the other very real risk, speaking of your case example earlier, is that it could be used against you in custody cases. And it's a well-documented phenomenon that having a diagnosis of autism is enough to have your malicious spouse wrest away control of your kids and maybe even visitation rights. And that's very harmful. And so for that reason, there's a ton of advocacy that is saying, like, yeah, self-DX is valid. And of course, most doctors would completely disagree. And I know that. But it's, well, I did my PhD on controversies. So whenever there's something like this, where everybody's like getting up in arms and strong opinions, and they're not loosely held at all, that's when I get more excited and interested, right? So I think that the discourse on that has not played itself out yet. There's a lot more coming down the pipe. So I think you're right that there's a risk of having the lived experience be like, then you start seeing race or gender in everything, even when it's not really there. But then the question is, who gets to decide? Because is it really, like you said, is it the person who has suffered from that marginalization the only judge? I don't know, maybe. Maybe it should be, but I think it can be weaponized also in the opposite direction. So there's some pushback. I think most of the pushback is not genuine engagement, and it's more just like, oh, I don't want to give, oh, those Black people, now being white is a minority. Like, no, I'm sorry, that's not true. But I think there's definitely some actors who try to weaponize this, and then everything you say can be used against you to prove that you're racist, and there's no way to disprove the hypothesis because it's unfalsifiable, let's say. So anyway.
Well, that's a great discussion, and I'm just mindful for the time. I think that we could talk for hours. So thank you, Shiri. It was like wonderful to have you with us, and thanks everybody. Please follow us through our website and social media platforms and our WhatsApp group. And we'll see you next time. And again, Shiri, thanks a lot. It was amazing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for having. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Shiri.